We've all thought about traveling through space, but traveling through time is a whole other matter. For one, we're told repeatedly that it just isn't possible. But we have some stories in this video that might just get you thinking and asking questions that no one has the answers to. Is time travel possible? Well, these people appear to be convinced. So join us to find out about the top 10 time travel episodes that will shock you. Number 10. Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard and the Parallel Universe. J.H. Brennan discusses an accidental time travel story in his book, Time Travel: A New Perspective, which will undoubtedly stay with you for a long time. According to the author, Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard unknowingly flew into a parallel universe. Sir Goddard was assigned to inspect an inactive airbase in Drem near Edinburgh, Scotland in 1935 when he was still a wing commander. He discovered the airbase in disrepair while flying over it with cattle grazing on the wild grass that had forced their way through the tarmac. It was in utter disarray. But later, while flying his biplane, he encountered some difficulties due to the harsh weather. To avoid an accident, Sir Goddard decided to return to the airbase he had passed over until the weather improved and he could return home safely. But suddenly the torrential rain gave way to bright sunshine as he approached the airbase. As if that wasn't strange enough, he also noticed that the airbase was in perfect working order. He even saw mechanics in blue overalls working on the yellow planes that were parked on the runway. And even more surprisingly, the planes were not those used by the Air Force at the time, and Sir Goddard was unable to recognize even one of them. It's strange because the instant renovation of the place couldn't have been possible, and more importantly, these guys weren't even dressed in the khaki-colored uniforms that were the norm back then. In addition, the Air Force painted all of its planes silver rather than yellow. 4 years later, Goddard, still perplexed as to what the hell had been going on, received the biggest shock of his life. Europe was at war, and when he happened to return to Drem, what do you think he saw? He saw everything that he had 4 years ago, but in 1935. There were people in blue overalls servicing the same yellow planes that he remembered from earlier. It was just like déjà vu. He even tracked down the planes he couldn't place before, which he then identified as a Miles Magister. So had Sir Goddard flown 4 years into the future? Skeptics believe Goddard was simply confused about his location, but that's an overly simplistic explanation. Could an acclaimed officer like him make such a simple error? Sadly, Sir Goddard died in 1987, so we're afraid we'll never know. Number 9. Elsie's Drive Back in the Past. Ken Mo's article, Time Traveler, was published in Strange Magazine 2 in 1988. The shocking account of a man known as LC was the subject of the article, but what makes this story so interesting? Well, after finishing lunch in the southwest Louisiana town of Abbeville, LC and his business associate Bob, which wasn't his real name, was driving along Highway 167 towards the oil center city of Lafayette in 1969. It was October 20th around 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and the weather was ideal with a clear sky and a gentle breeze. That's when they noticed an old turtleback car driving very slowly ahead of them. Of course, they were intrigued by the vehicle, which neither of them had seen before. It was very one-of-a-kind and definitely antique. But here's the catch. Despite its vintage appearance, the vehicle was in excellent condition. The two men passed the vehicle, but not before slowing down right next to it to inspect it thoroughly. The car had a large bright orange license plate with the year 1940 clearly printed on it, which was unusual because antique cars like the one in question were not allowed to be driven on the road unless they were part of a ceremonial parade. Things only got stranger from there. The driver was a young woman dressed in what appeared to be a vintage 1940s dress, complete with a hat and fur coat. Plus, there was also a child dressed in a heavy coat and a cap. The lady began to panic as the two approached the car, and they could see her face turning pale with fear. She frantically began to look back and forth as if she were in the middle of nowhere and looked to be on the verge of tears. Elsie asked if she needed any assistance, to which she replied in the affirmative, but she never rolled down the window or even looked him in the eyes. After requesting her several times to stop the vehicle, they finally saw her pull over on the side of the road. So Elsie and Bob passed her and pulled over in front of her. But as soon as they looked behind them, the vehicle was gone, vanished into thin air. This was a highway without any traffic, so disappearing like this was quite impossible, but it just had. Elsie and Bob decided to continue driving despite their shock and inability to describe what had just occurred. What else could they do? But as they were still on Highway 167, they saw another new car pass a very old car at a very slow speed. The cars were so slow that they looked like they had come to a halt, and they saw the same thing happen when the new car pulled over in front of the old car. It came to a halt and then vanished. The two couldn't believe what they were seeing. Even the guy in the other car was taken aback. The three began to describe what they had seen and started to look around to make sense of it all. The third guy insisted they should be reporting this to the police, as this, according to him, was a missing persons case. But Elsie and Bob refused, mainly because they had no idea where the woman and child along with the car had vanished to. This made the third man pause because he couldn't go to the police without these two. Everyone would think he was mad. But he exchanged phone numbers and addresses and kept talking about the incident with them just to make sure he hadn't lost his mind. Could this mystery woman have been a time traveler from the past who went forward in time? Or could she have been a person from the past who could never go back, stuck in limbo? We can't say with certainty. Number 8. The news that occurred 11 years after it was reported. News organizations would kill for a story that was 11 years ahead of its time. But to be honest, if this happened to any person, they'd probably lose their mind. This spine-chilling story was included in Ron Edwards, C.B. Colby's, and John Macklin's book, The Little Giant Book of Eerie Thrills and Unspeakable Chills. According to the authors, in 1932, newspaper reporter J. Bernard Hutton and photographer Joachim Brandt were assigned to cover the Hamburg shipyard in Germany for a feature story. After finishing their assignment and capturing everything they needed, they were about to leave when they heard the sound of aircraft engines and looked up to see the sky full of fighter planes. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire and bombs began to fall. The place had suddenly turned into a war zone. Things were exploding, buildings were collapsing, and death and chaos reigned supreme. Before rushing out to save their lives, Hutton asked a security guard if there was anything they could do to help, but was told to leave the area right away. But as they drove into Hamburg, things changed again. Everything returned to normal after the sky cleared. There was no blood or violence, the buildings were in good condition, and nobody appeared to be concerned. Nothing seemed to have happened. When Hutton and Brandt looked back at the shipyard, they saw nothing wrong with it. There was no damage or smoke coming from the buildings, which was very shocking, but what could they do about it? Obviously, the newspaper office did not believe the two, and worse, even the photographs Brandt had taken during the attack revealed that everything was normal. The shipyard looked just as brand new as it was before, and so their co-workers dismissed their story and claimed they must have stopped on their way to get a drink and that the alcohol was causing them to see things. Bernard Hutton later relocated to London just before the outbreak of World War II. What he read in the newspaper one morning in 1943 nearly stopped his heart. It was a story about a successful raid on the Hamburg shipyard by a Royal Air Force squadron. The likeness was uncanny. This was an exact replica of what he and Brandt had witnessed 11 years before. But how could it have been? The short answer is no one knows. Number 7. The Man Who Met Himself. Hacker Nordqvist, who was 36 years old, returned home on August 30th, 2006 to find his kitchen flooded with water. He crawled under the sink to fix the problem, thinking it was nothing more than a leak. But when he crawled inside the cabinet, he discovered that it just kept going, kind of like the wardrobe that led to Narnia. So he crawled on until he came to a halt at the end of the tunnel, and when he stepped outside, Nordqvist realized he had arrived in the future, specifically 2042. And who did he come across? Strangely, he met himself in the future, an old 72-year-old version of himself. Future Nordqvist was unsurprised to meet this individual and even told him things only he could have known. Plus, they even shared a tattoo. Of course, the future guy's tattoo was a little faded. Plus, they even took a selfie together. As usual, those who heard the story weren't all too keen to believe it. They wondered why the tattoo on the older man's arm hadn't bled or faded in so long, and it wasn't hard to find an old white man to pass for him. But who knows, Hacken may have been one of the lucky ones who got to experience this mystery. Number 6. The Time-Traveling Hipster. A time traveler was spotted in a 1941 photograph at the reopening of the South Fork Bridge in Goldbridge, British Columbia. When people saw the black and white photo, they saw that a man in modern clothing and sunglasses that weren't available in the 1940s stood in the midst of people who clearly belonged from that era. Further investigation revealed that the man's current appearance may not have been so novel, though, because the first sunglasses appeared in the 1920s. And many people assumed that the man was wearing a printed t-shirt, but upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a sweater with a sewn-on emblem, the type of clothing commonly worn by sports teams at the time. Still, he looks nothing like the people around him, and who knows, he may very well have just been traveling through time and space. Number 5. The Wall Street Scam Artist. On January 28, 2003, a man named Andrew Carlson was arrested and detained by police on Wall Street for insider trading. But what was truly insane was that Andrew went from having $800 to making, wait for it, $350 million in the stock market over a 2-week period. It's as if whatever he invested in became gold, because making the kind of money he did was nearly impossible. He was arrested by cops on suspicion of possessing illegal insider information, but when the police asked Andrew why and how he did it, they weren't expecting what he had to say. He claimed to be a man from the year 2256, and since he was from the future, he knew exactly how the stocks were going to perform. Obviously, the cops thought the guy was just spewing rubbish. We'd probably think that too. But get this, soon after he was released on bail, the man disappeared from the face of this earth. And even after repeated attempts, he couldn't be found. Could he possibly have been telling the truth? Who knows, but get this, Carlson actually also predicted the exact date of the US invasion of Iraq, so he may just have been speaking the truth. Number 4. The Man from Taured. This one is a particularly strange account that remains unanswered. The story goes something like this. On a hot afternoon in July 1954, a man arrived at the Haneda Airport, also known as the Tokyo International Airport. Described to be a Caucasian man with a beard, this man was known to have been French, but was also fluent in other languages, including Japanese. Now, there are a couple of versions of the story. Some say that the man handed over his passport to be stamped by the Japanese immigration officials. When the officers realized that while the passport seemed perfectly fine, the country where it was issued, Taured, did not exist in real life. In another version, the man mentioned that he was from Taured, and when the officers didn't believe him, he showed his passport. Either way, the man tried his best to convince the officers that Taured does in fact exist in real life. He claimed that it was located between France and Spain, and claimed that his hometown wasn't new either, and said it had been around for at least 1,000 years. Eventually, when the man was shown a world map, he pointed to the area which is currently known as the Principality of Andorra. He genuinely seemed confused as to why the authorities were hell-bent on calling this place Andorra. But eventually, the immigration officers arrested the man on suspicions of being a criminal. To interrogate him further and figure out what was going on, he was shifted to a hotel nearby. 2 guards were positioned outside his room, but guess what happened when they went to check on the man the next day? He had vanished, and there were no signs of his escape either. Even the documents he was carrying with him, which could have been used as evidence of this man's existence, disappeared as well. Could he have been a man from the future, or more interestingly, could he be living in a parallel universe where Andorra is nothing more than Taured? More logically, all this could also be the work of a talented storyteller, but there's no way to tell. Number 3. Bob White, Tim Jones. Between 2001 and 2003, Bob White or Tim Jones sent an unknown number of spam emails to the internet. The subject of the emails was always the same. Someone was looking for someone who could provide a dimensional warp generator. In some cases, he claimed to be a time traveler stuck in 2003, while in others, he claimed to be a time traveler seeking parts only from others who had moved through time. Several recipients began to respond in kind, claiming to have requested equipment such as dimensional warp generators. One recipient, Dave Hill, established an online store from which the time traveler purchased the warp generator, whereas another Dave charged thousands of dollars for time travel courses before selling the requested hardware. The name Bob White was derived from an alias used by the second Dave when responding, which was a reference to the Bob Whites of Trixie Belden fame. The time traveler was soon identified as professional spammer Robert J. Todino, also known as Robbie. Todino's attempts to travel through time were a serious belief, and while he believed he was perfectly mentally stable, his father was concerned that those responding to his emails had preyed on Todino's psychological issues. In his book Spam Kings, journalist Brian S. McWilliams, who had originally uncovered Todino's identity for Wired magazine, revealed that Todino had been previously diagnosed with dissociative disorder and schizophrenia, explaining the psychological problems of which his father had spoken. Todino's time traveler was referenced in the song Rewind by jazz trio Groove Lily on their 2003 album Are We There Yet? The song used phrases taken from Todino's emails within its lyrics. But as always, while there will always be some who don't believe such stories, there's still a chance that he really was a time traveler who really needed the part, just like the Doc from Back to the Future. Had he somehow got the part he needed, we may have been telling a completely different story. Number 2. The Philadelphia Experiment. Some people's lives appear to be straight out of a mystery novel. One such person is Al Bielek, who claimed to have been at the epicenter of the Philadelphia Experiment, which may be one of the 20th century's most famous conspiracy theories. If you're not familiar with the Philadelphia Experiment, it was a 1943 event in which the United States Navy allegedly teleported the USS Eldridge from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia. The ship was rendered invisible and only appeared at its final destination. Some men were said to have gone missing on the way from one state to the next, while others were said to have become fused to the ship itself. With such a bizarre story, it's difficult to believe such a thing occurred. Al Bielek, though, claims to have been a part of this experiment and has shared many details regarding the events that may or may not have transpired. He provided historical details that could be confirmed, as well as more specific details on the people and places involved. Al Bielek even made further claims that Nikola Tesla was part of the experiment and that 2 men were sent 40 years into the future and then back to the very ship. While that is insane to even think about, he also believed that these types of experiments date back to 1931, when Tesla discovered a way to make objects invisible. Al Bielek also explained that in 1983, he and his brother were commissioned to travel through this wormhole and destroy all of the equipment on the USS Eldridge. They apparently had to go back in time to avoid their arrival in 1983, which was causing a lot of problems. But when they attempted to travel back in time, they claimed to have ended up in 2137, where they spent many weeks in a hospital bed recovering from burns sustained during their teleportation. He also claimed to have traveled to 2749, where he spent 2 years living in that time period, aside from his other travels as well. According to Al Bielek, there were many floating cities that could be transported to other parts of the planet. He explained that the population in this world was apparently only 300 million people because only a few could adapt to this new environment. There was no military, no soldiers, no conflict between countries, and no government systems, and computers eliminated all physical labor. Money was also unnecessary in this future world where people had credits that they could use to buy whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it. Although Al Bielek's stories about the future are intriguing, he has been unable to prove his involvement in the Philadelphia experiment. Do you believe he had these experiences, or did he make them up? As always, it will be difficult for him to find those who accept his word as truth until others come forward to support his beliefs. Number 1. The 1928 Charlie Chaplin film. The first actual cell phone didn't hit the market until the early 1980s, but an Irish filmmaker claimed to have seen one in a 1928 Charlie Chaplin film. Perplexed by the appearance of the modern device in the out-of-date film, George Clark went so far as to suggest in a YouTube video that the cell phone-toting futurist is a time traveler. Clark's YouTube video, which featured a few minutes of behind-the-scenes footage from Chaplin's film The Circus, has since become viral. The scene in question depicts a woman or man in a long black coat walking down the street with something held up to their ear. If you look closely, you'll be able to see they're talking on a thin black device held to their ear. Plus, viewers would also be able to notice that the knuckles are bent in the shape of a phone which is placed against the ear. This isn't an ear trumpet, and because it's 1928, it's obviously not an AM/FM radio either. Technically, it's very hard to explain what is in her hand. There's no doubt that she's clearly speaking, but she's completely alone. Could time travel be possible? If you ask us, the answer could be anything. It's possible that there are some who are keen to hide such advanced technology from the public, and so make it seem like all these convincing stories are nothing more than conspiracies. Then again, it may just not be possible to move back in time. Unless someone figures out how to do so, we may all be stuck moving ahead in time and nothing more.